you're going to have anxiety until the day you die because you should have, but it should not be in the driving seat of your life, and that's the difference.
Owen O'Kane,
the world-leading psychotherapist,
whose books have enabled millions of people to master their anxiety and stress.
What are some examples of unhealthy ways to manage anxiety?
If the focus is about getting a short-term relief, then very often that has longer-term consequences. So, you hear it play out in different ways. It could be booze, it could be cannabis, it could be drugs, it could be people eating a lot more food than they perhaps need. The more you try to get rid of this, the more you're actually strengthening the dynamic longer term.
Do you have any tips, like any surefire ways that can calm anxiety?
To quickly settle, sometimes just these kind of slow bilateral taps, that can be just instantaneously soothing. Even if you kind of go more fundamental in that, I think that when you're having a moment, just kind of say, okay, what is it you need? You immediately get a sense of ease, because the anxiety then doesn't need to keep screaming and shouting. You've acknowledged it.
And if someone does want to take responsibility for managing their anxiety, where do they start?
It's a big question, but I think probably the best way to answer it would be that
this episode is dedicated to anyone who's ever been called too sensitive or too much. What's the worst side of anxiety that people in general experience?
I think for most people, it's the feelings that come with anxiety. It never comes as a singular thing. People think anxiety is like a feeling in itself, but it comes with a whole load of other feelings. It comes with fear, it comes with dread, it comes with overwhelm. So most people, when you talk to them about their anxiety, will never speak positively about the feeling that anxiety brings. People often see it as a very, very dark, negative thing that they have in their life. Something that they wish they didn't have. But interestingly, something that they get almost quite addicted to. They won't let go of it. So it's a really, really odd thing. I wouldn't call it love-hate, because I think that's too big. I think it's more of a hate, but it's something that they cling on to and they hold on to because they believe they have to. But I've never once in my entire career ever heard anyone describe their anxiety in a positive way. Ever.
For me, it's always been that feeling of if you're on a chair, in class, if you're sat on a chair and you're rocking back and the teacher's like, don't rock back on 2 legs, always stay on 4. But if you do rock back on 2, it's that moment where you've just gone slightly too far back and you're about to fall and smash onto the floor. It's just that moment where you realise you've gone too far. For me is that stomach turning feeling of dread. Do you think there's a difference in the way someone who has ADHD experiences anxiety compared to someone who is neurotypical?
The big question, and I think part of the challenge is they reckon about 50% of people with ADHD will have anxiety symptoms. Now, that's one key study. There are loads of studies. Some people will say it's more than that. I would probably argue it is more than that. But I think it depends on context, because I believe, as a psychotherapist, I never believe that people come along with a single thing. So if I meet somebody and they have ADHD, they may very well have ADHD, but they normally have other things going on. If I meet somebody who's anxious, they will probably have other things going on in their life. I think for somebody who's got anxiety related to their ADHD, the anxiety might play out as, for example, worry about being overwhelmed, or worrying about how they might cope, or just feeling overstimulated and it creating that sense of kind of angsty unease. Whereas somebody who has an anxiety disorder might be worrying about lots of things. They might be worried about their home life, their future, their career, their health, the state of the world. It'll be a much broader picture. It won't necessarily be as limited. Or it could be that they find it really difficult to function, not necessarily because of ADHD, but they find it hard to function because the worry has almost become crippling for them. It becomes too big. So I think it very often depends on context. I think if I'm working with someone who's got ADHD, they will often know the feeling of anxiety that moves in, but they will often link it to their ADHD, and they'll say, I know I did too much. I was overstimulated. I didn't create enough gaps in my day. So they can link it very, very clearly. Whereas then there might be moments when someone does describe anxiety in a different way. And even if they had ADHD, it may be actually that the anxiety isn't specifically linking to ADHD in that moment. It might be actually, this is a genuine anxiety presentation that's independent. So it's a massive question. And like, we could have 100 people in here And we can have this conversation with them, and some might be neurotypical, some not. And we're not going to get a clean cut answer to that because I think it depends on context.
Gosh, yeah, it's so true, isn't it? I think I guess whether you're ADHD or not, it is possible to have that racing mind, that army of highly caffeinated squirrels,
Yeah.
like in your head.
It's a good way of
around.
describing it. And it is like that, isn't it? It's like squirrels on steroids.
Yeah. Each one pulling you in a different direction sometimes. And it's just this paralysis of overwhelm. I'm fascinated to talk about the feeling of anxiety, and what can the symptoms of anxiety feel like from a scale of 1, which say is mild, to 10 being severe?
I mean, literally it can be anywhere on the spectrum. And I guess where I see anxiety differently, and this is going to sound very odd, but I don't really see, people will often describe anxiety as something that's happening to them. So they will often describe it like they'll describe it symptomatically. So they'll say, oh, I'm aware that my mind's in overdrive. They will describe physical symptoms, or they might describe emotional states that move in and out. But I guess for me, that I see anxiety as a part of you. So if I'm going to break it down really, really simply, I think every person who's anxious has a part of them that's frightened. So how, I don't know if you've heard of the IFS model. So it's an internal family systems model that talks about different parts of who we are. And one of those parts might be that you've got an anxious, scared part within you. And sometimes that will come up and it will play out in different ways. So sometimes to get your attention, it might play out in thought. Sometimes it might play out physiologically in the body. Sometimes it might play out in the emotional state, or it might play out in behaviors. And sometimes it might play out in them all together. But I think for most people, anxiety at some point, normally at the beginning, will make itself known within the body. So if I'm doing a talk, for example, at a big corporate event or something, and I say to people, where do you feel anxiety in your body? Most people will immediately, without even thinking, be able to locate where they feel anxiety. And for most people, they'll point to their tummy, their chest, their throat, their head. So people are able to identify really quickly that anxiety often presents in the body. But then it can move, obviously, quickly. The mind will start to present a lot of thought. In psychology, we call it metacognitions. So you get many thoughts. And the anxious thoughts will start to breed very, very quickly. And the problem then is that people then start to identify with the thought. The one thought, what if this goes wrong? People then start to listen to the thought and they think that's a really good point. What if that does go wrong? So then the more you kind of interlink with the thought, the more the brain will create more thoughts. So you kind of got this snowball effect where thoughts will start to accumulate quickly. And then, of course, the emotions then start to build and they can feel very, very overwhelming. So very often when you're in an anxious state, whether it be at 1 or at 10, it can ramp up very, very quickly. And I guess my work is about helping people see or to recognize really when their anxiety has moved in. What does that feel like for them? Where do they identify it? And I guess more importantly, how do they build a new relationship with their anxiety? Because this is going to sound like a really odd thing, but I think for me, that's one of the most important things. We could talk about every technique I know in anxiety, and I could teach you 100 techniques that we know clinically are helpful and they're useful. But I think if you have a negative relationship with your anxiety, the techniques won't make any difference. So for me, it's about getting to know the anxious part of you, building a new relationship with it, moving towards it instead of going the other direction. And I think for me, when people do that, they're halfway there. Then you can start to work on the techniques. Whereas I think a lot of people jump in very, very quickly and they think, right, just tell me what I need to do. How can I quieten the thoughts? How can I get rid of the feeling? Whereas I'm going the other direction. I'm saying we're not aiming to get rid of the feeling. We're actually aiming to go towards the feeling with curiosity and openness. And you can imagine for somebody who's got anxiety, that's going to freak them out because they spend a lot of time trying to get rid of the anxiety or push it down, where actually that will charge the anxiety up. So often treatments of anxiety feel counterintuitive to the person who's struggling because you're taking them in a totally different direction.
This anxious segment, this anxious child that we all have within us? Is that something that we all have sort of from birth, or is it a consequence of our surroundings?
Again, it's never a single thing. I mean, and not everyone will have it. I mean, some people may have grown up in very, very stable, supportive environments. They might have had good social circumstances. They may have good genetics. So not everyone will struggle with anxiety. Everyone has anxiety. So it's a normal part of the human condition. We're hardwired to be on guard for threat. Without it, we wouldn't survive. So everyone has a degree of anxiety, but not everyone has anxiety that creates difficulty for them. But I think, if you come from a background where there has been a lot of threats. So my own story is probably a good way to answer the question. So I grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. So growing up there in Belfast when things were tough, to be anxious was a really helpful thing because you were watching out for the next bomb or the next riot to break out. So I wouldn't have called it anxiety when I grew up there. I just I had this feeling of being heightened and being on guard and being on watch. But actually that was a really helpful thing. It's only when you leave and then suddenly you realize I don't need to be on watch, I don't need to be on guard anymore, that you suddenly realize, okay, well, this is a mechanism that I have, but I don't need it anymore, but I can't really get rid of it. It's still with me. So I think for most people, it's about recognizing your anxiety is a healthy part of you, but if it starts to get in the way of your life and you start to notice that there's this part of you that comes out a lot, whether that's in your body or the way you're thinking or these emotional states, and it's constantly telling you to watch out or to be prepared or to keep an eye out for or be vigilant, then you've got to start to build a new relationship, because if that anxious self is in control, you're going to feel very out of control. So your job is to get to know the anxious self and start to kind of move towards it and get to know it and start to kind of re-educate it.
The topic of it almost being an inbuilt mechanism to defend yourself, like you in Ireland, it was a necessary component for your safety. Do you think anxiety can be an evolutionary hangover for humans? In other words, does it serve a purpose to us?
100%. I mean, without it, we wouldn't. That's so. I mean, primarily, it's a good thing. I mean, I get annoyed when I hear people talk about anxiety like it's some monstrous demon. Actually, it's a really healthy human mechanism, and it's meant to be there. We need a certain degree of anxiety. You and I are having this conversation today. We probably both have a degree of anxiety because it's an important conversation. We want it to go well, and that anxiety will be a useful stimulus to make sure that it is a good conversation. Or, if you and I if we were doing a big speaking event, we would probably have some degree of anxiety before we go on to do it, because it's it's going to be helpful. It's going to get us out there. It's going to keep us on our toes. It's going to make sure that we think clearly and we deliver the right information. So anxiety is a useful thing. But I guess it's when the anxiety I describe it like a bath filling with water. If the anxiety, you keep running the tap, you get to a point when the water starts to overspill and then you start to feel saturated and you can't really regulate the thoughts, or you can't level, or you can't function well, then that's when you kind of need to start regulating it better.
And if someone has a really bad episode and say they have an anxiety attack, like I thankfully haven't had an anxiety attack in a couple of years, but I did have lots when I was very young. I had my first one when I was 6 years old in a classroom, and I have suffered with them throughout my life. So my question is, what is it that shifts us from an anxious state into a state where we are actually having some kind of physical emotion like a anxiety attack?
I mean, there's a difference between anxiety and I think what you're describing, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like what happened to you was maybe a panic attack. And there's a difference between the two. Anxiety can be a much more generic, generalized state, whereas panic, when it moves in, and again, it's like that bath filling with water. It's almost like the body gets saturated with chemicals. You've got too much adrenaline, you've got too much cortisol in your body. So it literally feels like it's got to go somewhere, so that will manifest itself in the body. And for most, do you mind me asking, actually, when you had the panic attack, can you remember what it was like?
So I was sat in the back of a classroom, I go back to those highly caffeinated squirrels. I was daydreaming in my own world, and the teacher pointed at me and said, "Do you know the answer to this question?" And in that moment, all of the other classmates looked at me. All of the attention, all of the pressure was on me, and suddenly I could feel quite instantly my heart rate started to go. Became very aware of it. I thought I was having a heart attack.
Yeah.
I ran out of the classroom and I said, "Please call an ambulance. I'm having a heart attack." And the paramedic told me that I was having, they said an anxiety attack, but this was years ago, but I remember it so vividly. What do you think happened then?
I mean, you've described brilliantly. I mean, it's a textbook description of a panic attack, and that's where the language always gets a bit confused. I hear people all the time saying, "Oh my God, I had a terrible panic attack." And you say, "What happened?" And they weren't having a panic attack at all. What you've described as a panic attack, because with panic attacks, what happens is people get physiological symptoms like the heart's beating quickly, they're breathing too fast. They feel something terrible is going to happen. They often feel like they're having a heart attack. They think they're going to die. They often call an ambulance. So a panic disorder is when you misinterpret what's going on physiologically in the body. And because the misinterpretation's creating a great sense of panic, then what you get is you get this kind of panic circle. You get like a panic loop. So panic is a misinterpretation of what's happening in the body, whereas anxiety is much, much more generic. And it doesn't tend to be as... Anxiety can go on. People can have an anxiety episode and it can go on for hours, it can go on for days, where they just kind of feel this general sense of unease, discomfort, worry, just not feeling right. Whereas panic is much, much, much more heightened. I'm glad you described it that way, actually, because so many people get the two mixed up. But panic disorder specifically is about your misinterpreting. So what happened to you then? You weren't clearly having a heart attack. Nothing terrible was happening to you. Nothing was wrong. But in that moment, the physiological symptoms become so big that you go into that state of absolute terror where you believe, "Oh God, this is awful. Something terrible is going to happen." But it never does, and the symptoms do level.
See, I never knew that they were two different things. I thought a panic attack was an anxiety attack. I just thought it was two different ways of saying the same thing. So an anxiety attack, what is an anxiety attack, and what does an anxiety attack look like?
I wouldn't even call them attacks. I would call them an anxiety episode.
Right.
So you might, people describe them in different ways. So you might have a period when you're busy and you've got a lot going on in your life. And you're just aware that you're maybe not sleeping as well, or that you're overthinking, or you're just not feeling 100%, or you're feeling a bit preoccupied or distracted. And you might get multiple symptoms. You're not eating as well as you would normally do. You might feel a bit more tired. You might feel that your concentration's not as good. So it can play out for people in many, many different ways. And those episodes can be shorter term, they can be longer term, or they can be more chronic. So it can be a much broader presentation. Whereas panic, a panic attack or a panic episode or panic disorder is very, very specific, just like we've described. And I think that's often the problem, is I think people often... you probably heard me mention before, I believe that a diagnostic language is really important some of the time, but I also believe some of the time it can be really unhelpful. And like for ADHD, it's useful to have a diagnosis. We know that because it can lead to the right treatment. It can lead to the right medication if that's appropriate. But I also think that as human beings, sometimes we struggle, and that means our anxiety might be higher, our mood might drop. And for me, I'm more interested in the humanity of struggle, because I think if we get too fixated on diagnosis and labels, then there's a danger that the person becomes over-identified with the diagnosis or the label. Whereas I think it's more helpful to think, actually, you're a human. Sometimes you are going to struggle. Sometimes it's not going to be perfect. Sometimes it's going to be difficult. So how do you work with the imperfection? How do you work with your humanity? For me, certainly as a therapist, I often think that's a much more helpful way to work. Because I've worked with people over the years, and if we talk about anxiety, for example, if somebody gets entrenched in their identity with anxiety, it can be really difficult to separate them from their identity. And and this is part of the addicted to anxiety, why I've kind of decided to write this book. It's very, very easy for someone to say, "No, I can't do it because my anxiety won't let me." or they don't want you to challenge them in therapy because they think, no, but it's not my fault, it's my anxiety. And I think it's a really hard conversation to have. That very often we contribute more to our own struggle than we realize. And that's never, ever, an easy conversation in therapy to have, because most human beings, I've never had a client ever come into me and say, I'm struggling because I've screwed up, or I'm struggling because I'm screwing up, or I'm managing my life, or I'm not taking responsibility. Everyone will come into therapy and they'll say, I'm screwed up, or I'm struggling, or I'm having a hard time because my childhood, my diagnosis, my family, my partner, my husband, my wife. And that might be true to an extent. I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that it's a contributory factor. Very often it will be. But you rarely get people coming in holding ownership or responsibility for their part. And I guess I like to see my job, or a big part of my work, is helping people take responsibility. It's never about blaming. You're not blaming somebody or you're not shaming them, but it's about you're probably playing a bigger part in your struggle than you realize. And what can you do? And I would say, like, even with someone with ADHD who might be struggling, if I meet somebody and they say, I'm having a really tough time, it's my ADHD and it's awful and you don't understand and all of that stuff, there might be some degree of truth in that. But if I'm working with a person and I understand that they're not taking any responsibility, they're not compliant with their medications, they're eating shit food, they've got no balance, they've got no structure, they're not seeking the right help and support, then I kind of almost feel I've got to challenge that, because that person isn't taking responsibility for how they manage their ADHD, and that they're two totally different stories. Does that make sense? And that's something that's sometimes really, really difficult. So it's always a balancing act between working with the reality of what you're dealing with, but also about, okay, what can you do that proactively helps support you? And if I spot a struggle, if someone says, but I just find it really hard to focus, or I find it really hard to commit to this, well, then we work with that struggle rather than avoid the struggle. So I think it's always a two-way relationship between understanding the reason someone struggles. Because I think that if we put, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. If we were talking about ADHD, if we're talking about addiction, if we were talking about depression, anxiety, the diagnostic labels are one part of the equation, but we've got to look at all of the other factors and help the person understand that as well.
No, your phone isn't solely to watch brilliant new episodes of ADHD Chatter. You can also download helpful apps on it too, like Tiimo app. Tiimo app is a perfectly tailored app designed specifically to help improve your organization. It's something I use every day to make my busy schedule manageable, and it works like a charm. Organizing a podcast, writing books, taking meetings, and running errands is so much to manage, you can end up getting overwhelmed and forgetting things. That is, if it weren't for the Tiimo app. And this is how. Tiimo is designed specifically to hack the neurodivergent way of thinking. We have a brain that might struggle with time agnosia, object permanence, memory cognitive load, task initiation anxiety, or procrastination. All things I also fall victim to. That is the ad read halftime whistle. Just a little more to go. The award-winning Tiimo app is the perfect life hacking tool to help your time management and kick you up the bum when you need it most. If you want to stay ahead of the competition, then the visual planning Tiimo app is specifically designed to help your structuring, organizing, focusing, and goal setting. It has a visual timer providing a tangible and visual representation of time to help users pace themselves so you never miss a deadline ever again. It also has an efficient lock screen reminder service to alert those of you who are very out of sight, out of mind, with your chores and afraid you might forget them. It brilliantly centers all of your tasks in one place to streamline your overflowing schedules and make them much more digestible and a lot less intimidating. And for those who find big tasks too overwhelming to even start, Tiimo breaks them down into more manageable subtasks to get the ball rolling. And if you think Tiimo won't improve your life, you're wrong. Without their sponsorship, we'd not be able to survive as a podcast. So in some ways, they already are. Back to the interview. And if someone does want to take responsibility for managing their anxiety, where do they start in recognizing what the source is? Say someone's anxious about their relationship, or they're anxious about losing their job, or they're anxious about they've been to a party and they wish they didn't say something and now they're overthinking what they said. Where does someone start in separating what's a rational anxiety over a real thing that's happened compared to perhaps like an irrational anxiety that is within them that is more difficult to isolate?
It's a big question, but I think probably the best way to answer it would be that, worry is, if you're worried about paying your mortgage, for example, or you haven't got a job, or one of your kids is sick, or whatever the context might be, that's functional worry. So I wouldn't be concerned about that. I wouldn't see that as an abnormal state of worry. I think that's functional, and to have some of those worries is it's part of the human condition. If I was with somebody and they said to me, okay, every time I go out the door, I feel ill or I feel sick at the thought of meeting someone, or the thought of speaking to someone, or the thought of being introduced to someone new, well then that's worry that sounds very, very different. Or if I meet somebody and they say, I can't leave my house, or I spend my entire day worrying about lots of things, then you've moved into a different category of worry. Or, for example, if someone had OCD and they said, I can't go out until I've double-checked everything 20, 25 times, then you know that that's moved outside of functional, normal worries. It's moved into worry that's kind of, potentially problematic and creating difficulties. So I think it's always about helping the person identify, okay, does this feel like it's normal worry that most people would have? Or does this feel like this is worry and anxiety that's actually getting in the way of your life? And the only person that can answer that is the person that you're working with when you're exploring with them what's happening for them. And I guess then if they do think, actually, this is a bigger problem than I perhaps admit, it's like any issue, really. You're encouraging them to acknowledge that this might be a problem. And that it might be something. And I don't mean problem in the negative sense, but it's an issue that might need a bit of attention and support. And for me, if someone's talking about anxiety or mood or whatever they're talking about, if the good days are really starting to be outnumbered by the bad days, and that's happening regularly, then it's normally time to get support. So the recognition and the acknowledgement is the first step. Because if you don't go there, I'm wasting my time as a therapist if someone isn't on board with what my kind of thoughts are or what my hypothesis is. Like, say I was working with you and I thought you were highly anxious, and you were sat there saying to me, no, I'm good. Not a problem for me. I'm doing completely fine. And I'm thinking the opposite. We'll go nowhere until I get you on board with my thoughts. And I'm never going to coerce it, or I'm never going to force it, but actually we will go nowhere until we're both aligned. So I guess really that's what you're doing all of the time when you're working with somebody, is you're trying to help them. Well, you're trying to really, you're trying to see whether they see what you see, and are they on board with it? And if they're not on board with it, then my work is to try and help them get there as best I can do.
Do you have any examples of patients that have come to you as a therapist and they've explained how they're self-medicating, self-managing their anxiety? Maybe they've seen something on social media, they've read something somewhere, and you're thinking that is a terrible way to manage anxiety. That is a really unhealthy way. What are some examples of unhealthy ways to manage anxiety?
Where to start? Look, the obvious ones are, I meet people all the time and they'll say, I'm feeling really anxious, I'm a bit overwhelmed, I'm struggling. You say, what do you do to manage it? And they'll say, well, I a couple of glasses of wine every night, and that really takes the edge off it. So that's probably the most obvious example. So, and you kind of get it because shorter term, it will give them relief. So the booze will take the edge off it because, you get an increase of GABA receptors, and that will kind of, shorter term give them a sense of comfort, and it will kind of take the thread off. But of course, the next day, the GABA receptors will they'll go the opposite direction, and then they'll feel anxious again. So that's one classic example. Or somebody will say, well, I smoke a couple of joints a day and there's no harm in it and it's absolutely fine. But again, you can get a similar problem, because if the solution is about getting a short-term, if the focus is about getting a short-term relief, then very often that has longer-term consequences. So, you hear it play out in different ways. It could be booze, it could be cannabis, it could be drugs, it could be people, eating, a lot more food than they perhaps need. People will often do lots of things that distract them. They will say, oh, well, I just do anything to take my mind off it. So often what you get is you'll hear people talking about stuff that's often about getting away from the anxiety. So when I hear that, so if I'm working with a client and I hear them describe attempts to get away from the anxiety, or attempts to not feel the anxiety, or attempts to numb it down or to repress it, well, then my instinct is always to go the opposite direction and help them see that what they're doing is they're making the choice to shorter term not feel the anxiety, which, like you and I probably would want to do the same. If we had an anxiety episode at the moment, the immediate instinct would be to try and not feel it. But that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do, because all you're doing is you're just pushing it down shorter term. But the problem is, we know from all the research that the more you try and push anxiety down shorter term, what you do is you maintain it longer term. You're always kind of trying to explain that to the person, that the more you try to get rid of this, the more you're actually strengthening the dynamic longer term. People will use all sorts. Anything they can think of that they believe will get rid of it quickly. Social media is another good example. People go on and they scroll. They go through, and we know, I know I've heard you talk about this in the pod as well, and, they'll get the dopamine hit very, very quickly in the first couple of minutes of scrolling. They will get that hit. It's distracting. They're not thinking about other stuff. But again, we know from the research that dopamine hit wears off quite quickly. And what it can do is actually it can end up aggravating anxiety. So anything that's avoidant, shorter term, is generally not a great idea.
Yeah, no, it's so relatable. I've definitely been guilty of trying to distract myself from the anxiety before. Cleaning for me is
I thought what you got. I wish I had that one.
Well, you could tell if my flat's looking good, then I'm probably going through an anxious episode. I say I don't clean because my home is a mess. I clean because my mind is a mess. And I didn't realize that that's what I was doing until starting this podcast and speaking to people like yourself. But social media is so true. Gravitate towards that news feed. Gravitate towards that finger swiping, funny video, funny cat falling down the stairs. And it's such a distraction, and your problems get pushed to the back seat. But then you just get, the effect goes down. You're not getting anything from your phone screen anymore. And in fact, the anxiety, you haven't, like you said, you haven't done anything to manage it. You haven't done anything to dilute the anxiety, and it comes back so much stronger.
Well, it's a bit like for anybody listening who has got kids. If you think about the anxious self, if you have young kids and they're anxious or they're distressed in any way, shape, or form, they tend not to give up until you've paid attention to them. And if you ignore them, or if you move in the other direction, or you don't respond to them in any way, shape, or form, they will probably keep kicking off until you respond to them. And I think when you're dealing with your anxiety, it's a bit like that as well. You can try whatever you want to get away from it, but it will keep coming back because it's trying to get you to pay attention. I remember as therapists, we have to have therapy. That's part of the deal. And I can remember years ago, there was a particular period, there was a lot going on in my life at the time, and I was very, very aware that my own anxiety had ramped up, which I never apologise for talking about, because I think there's often a danger with therapists, particularly there can be an expectation with therapists that they're the expert and they have all the information, whereas actually we're all human beings at the end of the day. But I was going through this period and I was talking to my own therapist about it, and I was going for a run, I was meditating, I was doing hot yoga, I was eating the right foods. I was kind of like the perfect, anxiety kind of guru in terms of doing all of the things that are meant to get rid of anxiety. And I was having this period and I just couldn't get my anxiety to level off. It was just like, it was really, really ramped up. And my therapist, who's brilliant, said to me at the time, said to me, do you mind me asking? He said, so you're going for a run every day, you're meditating, you're doing your yoga, you're reading the right books, you're listening to podcasts, so you're doing all of the things that we know help. You're eating good foods. I don't drink that much anyway. So, I was tick boxing all of the things. And he said to me, why are you doing all of these things? And I said, well, to manage my anxiety. And he said, are you doing it to manage your anxiety? Or are you doing it to get rid of your anxiety? And in that moment, and I should know better. In that moment, I thought, oh my God, that's exactly what I'm doing. I don't want to feel the anxiety. And he said, putting effort into doing all of this stuff as a means of getting rid of your anxiety is counterintuitive. He said, it's never about getting rid of the anxiety. It's about going towards it and being curious about it. And it's fascinating. The moment it was like one of those kind of golden moments that you have in your own therapy where I stopped and I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to stop trying to get rid of it. And of course, the moment you just stop fighting and wrestling and resisting it, then things leveled and quietened. And of course, then I could make use of the techniques and use them properly. And I think that's a really important, for anybody listening who does, struggle badly with their anxiety, whether it's ADHD linked or not. I'm less interested in that. I'm just more interested in the fact that this can be uncomfortable and it can be difficult. The more you fight, resist, push down, and that's your goal and that's your aim, the more your anxiety is going to come back until you're willing to meet it.
How can we help stabilise our anxiety?
So your aim is never, for me, it's never about, I've said a number of times that it's never about getting rid of, pushing down, not wanting to have the feeling. I guess for me, it's about how can you learn to work with the anxious self is a really, really powerful thing. So you're not stabilizing it to get rid of it. What you might want to do is you might want to quieten the noise so that you can listen to what the anxiety is trying to tell you. And I think that is one of the most important things I can say, is because if you're willing to go toward your anxious self and you're willing to listen to what it's trying to tell you, really, there's often something quite important in there. It might be encouraging you to slow down. It might be encouraging you to reevaluate. It might be encouraging you to create a steadier inner platform. So very often there's kind of quite positive intent behind it, but often what you're trying to do is you just quieten down the noise a little bit. So, you need to you do need to steady the body, you do need to quieten the mind, and you need to kind of help regulate the emotions that are there. But the reason you're doing that is, you're not doing that to not feel the anxiety. You're doing it so that you can be present with the anxiety and listen to what it's trying to communicate to you.
I'm just thinking about recent examples in my life where I've been at a social event and I've had to stand up quite abruptly and leave the table to almost calm down.
Yeah.
Because again, maybe this is panic, maybe that's not anxiety. But in moments like that, when someone is maybe on the brink of quite a catastrophic episode in the moment, do you have any tips, like any surefire ways that can calm anxiety in that moment?
It depends on where you are. The techniques are, there are literally hundreds. I guess for me, if you're at a dinner table or something, it might be really hard to sit and meditate or, use breath work because, and these are all really helpful things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking them in any way, shape or form. I think breath work can be powerful, just that slow regulated breathing. We know that will activate a parasympathetic nervous response, and that can be useful. But if you want to go really, really simple, for me, I often say to people, just repeat something, just repeat a phrase over and over and over again. That can be helpful, like, I can handle this, I can handle this. You repeat that over and over and over again because it will help reduce that kind of cognitive activity. But even if you want to do something, to quickly settle, sometimes just these kind of slow bilateral taps, the thing called bilateral stimulation, which is just left to right. You can tap on your knees or you can tap, these are called like butterfly taps are called. That can be just instantaneously soothing. But I guess even if you kind of go more fundamental in that, I think that if you're aware, if you kind of think of the anxious self, that part of you, that scared little boy, girl, person within you that's struggling, if you can just go to that part and when you're in an episode or having a moment, just kind of say, okay, what is it? What is it you need? What is it I can do? So I'm going back to the analogy of kids again, because I think it can be a really useful one. So if you're willing to go towards the anxiety and just kind of say, it's all right, I'm here. What's happening? What do you need? How can I look after you? You immediately get a sense of ease. Because the anxiety then doesn't need to keep screaming and shouting. You've acknowledged it. You've given it space. You're acknowledging its presence. You know it's there. But more than that, you're willing to go towards it. So imagine at the minute, like, you know, God forbid, you say you freaked out at the moment and you had a really bad moment and you felt really anxious and things felt difficult. Can you imagine how difficult it would be if I just kept going on, or we didn't acknowledge it in any way, shape or form? Whereas if I stopped and said, you know, it's all right, it's no big deal, we can grab a minute and we'll settle down, it's okay, we'll have a chat about it, you'd probably instantaneously relax because I've been able to acknowledge it. And I guess in some ways, when we're self-regulating our own anxiety, what you're willing to do is you're willing to think, all right, this is going on at the moment, so I am going to go towards it, and I'm actually going to almost talk myself down. Because we all have the ability to do that there. So it's kind of almost, I mean, that in itself can be one of the most powerful things to do, is just that it's okay, it's all right, we got it, it's no big deal. You're not judging it, you're not ashamed of it, you're not embarrassed by it. You just kind of say, all right, okay, I'm having a moment, having a difficult moment. They come, they go, it's no big drama. So it's kind of, it's changing. I mean, it's a really valid point you've made, because ultimately this is about changing how you feel about self and how you feel about anxiety. Not only anxiety, but all of these other parts of you, you know, and I'm sure you've heard in the podcast all the time, even with ADHD, people may not like the part of them that's anxious. They may not like the part of them that's highly sensitive. They may not like the part of them that doesn't concentrate as much as they would like to, or doesn't cope. In moments, they may get really angry and frustrated with that part of self, but it never helps if you're going to kind of form a conflicted relationship with that part of self. You know, all you do is just kind of create more resistance. So it's just almost like, if anxiety is a prominent feature for you, well, then you really get to know that part of you well, and you align with it, and you understand it, and you work with it. You don't go the other direction.
I think shining a light on it, like you suggested then, and actually being honest and say, I'm having a moment, is such good advice, because a lot of the time it's so easy to not share it and to suffer in silence, and say I'm at that dinner table and I can feel that dread, that anxiety building, and I'm there in silence, and all I can think about is the anxiety. And actually, if I just said, oh, do you mind if I take 5 minutes? Or if I'm with one person that I know well and I can just share, I'm having a moment here, do you mind if, and you can have a dialogue, and it disarms it. Absolutely.
And that's a brilliant word, actually. So you are kind of disarming it, and you're taking the power out of it. So you're taking the power out not to disown the part. I think this is a really important thing. Is I say in the book a lot that regardless of what part of self you're dealing with, if you're not willing to go towards it, then what you do is you disown a part of self. And why would you disown a part of self? So why would you disown your anxious self? I've got to I don't know if this is helpful, but sometimes when I do bigger events, so if I'm doing big speaking events, and I do a lot of them these days, so it's not like it's a new thing. And when I do them well, and I enjoy them. This is the irony. I mean, I go on and they're normally a really nice audience, and I go on and I do my job and I do it well, and I always feel great afterwards, and I've had a good time. But I'm also aware that every time I do a speaking event, there's always this moment, like 30 seconds before I go on, when my kind of anxiety will just pop in, and it will kind of, and I'll kind of, I'll be aware of it in my body, and then I'll notice my mind starting to, what if they don't like it? What if you forget who's on before you? Oh my God, that guy was brilliant. All the usual nonsense and bullshit that goes on in their heads. And I'm very aware of it. And I did an event a couple of weeks ago, and I was literally just about to go on, and it was about 30 seconds. It came, I remember actually thinking before I went on, God, I'm not feeling anxious this time. And then I'd literally just had the thought, and then suddenly I was aware that my anxiety moved in. And what I decided to do, and I guess I've become quite skilled at doing it, was I kind of made the decision that my anxiety comes with me. So I don't kind of leave it. I don't start to argue with it. I don't start to fight with it in that moment when I'm backstage. What I kind of decide to do is I just decide to bring the anxiety with me onto the stage. And I've done this a number of times. So if I've got a big event, and if they've asked me to come and talk about anxiety, I might even use an example and say, okay, let me just talk you through what happened to me 2 minutes ago. And I'll tell the story honestly. And most people in the room at some level get it. And I kind of think, one, it takes the pressure of me that I'm not here as some expert who has all the answers to everything. I'm here as a human being with some professional expertise that supports my work. But it almost immediately kind of takes away the stigma, it takes away the shame, it takes away the judgment. And then suddenly you think, everyone in this room got the story. They either laughed or they reacted in some way, shape or form. And I know it's a different type of example, but it's just a willingness to say, this is all right and I can allow this to be, because most times it works fine and nothing terrible happens. So if you're at a dinner table and you have a moment, there's probably a lot of people in the room having similar moments and they're just managing it in a different way. So it's kind of normalizing the struggle as well.
So helpful, almost sort of becoming friends with it, reminding yourself that you're not alone, and it's a very normal thing. Catastrophizing is a word that keeps coming up on this podcast and in the community, and obviously it's a very horrible word to catastrophize. It puts all sorts of negative images in your head. For example, if your boss texts you and says, "Can we have a quick chat Monday morning?" but they don't give you any context, or your friend replies to a text message with a thumbs up emoji. It's all very standard stuff, but you can, and I'll say the word catastrophize, in your head, and you'll jump to the worst case scenario. You might not even sleep all weekend until you get some reassurance that your world isn't about to end. That's the reality of what I hear the listeners of this podcast report. How would you define the word catastrophizing?
I think the key, probably a more important word for me outside of catastrophizing, as you said, they probably wouldn't sleep all weekend until they get reassurance. And I think the two are very, very closely linked. So if you think of a classic definition of anxiety, it's an intolerance of uncertainty. So in the example you've just given, is the one thing that the person hasn't got is they haven't got certainty. And their problem with it, and the reason they're catastrophizing is because they're intolerant of not knowing. I think there's a real kind of clue in the title, really, that if you've got situations where you don't have an immediate answer, or you're not quite sure what the outcome's going to be, or you're not quite sure where this is going to lead to, maybe the not knowing can be okay. So it's always about developing a more tolerant relationship with, okay, well, I'm not going to see the boss until Monday. This isn't in my control. So until then, I'm just willing to be comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing. And I get, if you take this broadly, a lot of this is about the willingness to be uncomfortable. And I know that sounds like a really weird, odd thing to say, but actually you're getting comfortable with discomfort. And I think that is one of the key things around anxiety, that, of course it's uncomfortable not knowing why your boss wants to talk to you on Monday morning, but lots of life is uncomfortable. Lots of life is unknown. None of us have a clue what's coming next. None of us really have a predictable trajectory. The entire of, all of life is uncertain, and that is a given reality for us most. So I guess really the more you can use the everyday stuff, like, we're talking about the new book coming out. No idea how that's going to go. Genuine, even though I've done it a few times before, no idea. There are aspects of it that are not in my control. Can I be comfortable with that? Yeah, I can be. Because I know from before and from previous experience, if I tie myself up in knots worrying about it, trying to control it, trying to predict it, then it's exhausting and it's incredibly stressful. So I guess a lot of this is about, if you're a catastrophizer, and by that I mean you're overthinking, you're worrying, what if, and suddenly, the mind will work with you in that there, because it's a great storyteller. And it will find every possibility, because remember, the human mind will keep creating stories until it thinks it's reached an outcome or a conclusion. That's what it's kind of designed to do. But equally, it's your responsibility to know that, okay, when I allow my mind to do this, then it goes in a very, very different direction, and it creates a lot of distress and a lot of discomfort. So it's my responsibility to recognize, okay, I'm about to spiral. I'm catastrophizing. I can disrupt that. I don't need to go that road. and I can make a decision. Okay, I can make a decision that I'm willing to be with the unknown, and I'm willing to be uncomfortable.
Would you advise people obviously in the boss situation, you can probably ask for context on, you might be able to reply and say, oh, can you just let me know roughly what the meeting is going to be about? So you can take steps to advocate for yourself to maybe alleviate some of that catastrophizing. But you probably can't reply to someone who sends you a blunt text message and say, do you hate me? Because that is a bit much, maybe. Would you advocate and advise people to always push for context and try to fill in the uncertain gaps to alleviate some of that anxiety?
Generally, no, because often it's kind of like a bottomless pit. Because the person that might then, I mean, you could, like if it's helpful, you may, in a situation like that, you could say, oh, do you mind me asking, do I need to prepare anything for that? Is there anything you need from me? There are ways of doing it. But I think if the goal is to get reassurance, to try and relieve the anxiety, then it's never going to be a good thing, because remember that the motivation for the person seeking reassurance is to not feel anxious. So if they know that the reason they're getting reassurance is to try and quieten the anxiety, then actually all they're going to do is they're going to fuel the anxiety, because what will happen is the mind will say, well, how do you know he meant that? It will then create another story. So it will feel counterintuitive not to reassurance seek, but actually being able to not reassurance seek and say, okay, I'm willing to be with the uncertainty. I'm willing to get comfortable with not knowing, and I can wait and I'll deal with it then. Because then what you do is you really do disrupt quite powerfully these patterns of reassurance seeking. And I guess that's what you're trying to do all of the time with anxiety. Instead of going the normal, predictable route that you would normally go, you're kind of thinking, all right, I understand totally what I'm doing at the minute. I'm reassurance seeking. I'm avoiding. I'm trying to get as much information as I can. You need to get to know your tricks and what you do to manage your anxiety. And if you know that you're doing stuff, and the simplest way I can put it is that if the goal is short-term relief, just be mindful, and then the outcome is going to be longer-term anxiety.
It's fascinating. It seems to be a lot of the sort of perhaps unhealthy ways to manage anxiety have this similar trend. Like they take the pressure off in the short term, but then they just magnify the problem in the long term.
That's the problem. And that is one of the biggest challenges with anxiety. And this is kind of why I framed this book in the context of addiction, because so much of it is addictive. We become addicted to the thoughts. We become addicted to the way we think. We become addicted to the emotional states. We even become addicted. I had a client say to me a couple of weeks ago, she woke up, been working with her for probably a good few months, 2-3 months now. And she woke up a few weeks ago and she said she got out of bed, and she said for the first time in about 5 years, she didn't feel knots in her stomach. And she thought, oh my God, I haven't woken up feeling anxious today. And then she said she immediately thought, what's wrong? Because she missed the physiological feeling of anxiety in her body. And then she started to worry why she wasn't worried. So we can become very hooked and very, very attached. And I think that when the patterns get set up, when they quite habitually become about looking for the quick fix, if you think of addiction broadly, very often people with addiction in broader terms want to numb, they want to soothe, they want to not feel, they want stimulus quickly. But often it is a short-term hit. And I think sometimes anxiety and the maintenance of anxiety can be about short-term relief. It's not a hit, but it's often about a short-term relief so that people can feel better. But often it comes with longer-term problems and consequences.
Your book is called Addicted to Anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Is there truth in that? Can we get addicted to anxiety, and why would that be?
Sounds like a journalist question, but it's a really, really good question. And I agonized about the title because, of course, it's not a diagnosis. You're not going to find addiction to anxiety in any psychology textbook, and it's not a DSM disorder. But I do wholeheartedly believe that we get addicted to the process of anxiety, not anxiety in itself, the process of anxiety, because every addiction comes with a promise. Okay, and most addictions comes with a promise of making you feel better, helping you escape, it depends on context, but generally there is a promise with addiction. And I think anxiety in itself comes with a promise of keeping you safe and protecting you. So it's quite alluring. And to ask someone to let that go, particularly when they become dependent on the process of anxiety and they've lived with it for a long time, they can become addicted to the process. They can become addicted to the way they think, to the emotions, how the body responds without even realising it. And I talk in the book about, there was a brilliant story years ago. I was running a group, an anxiety group in the NHS. And these were a group of people who had chronic anxiety. They had been around all the treatment programmes. And the psychiatrist I was working with at the time knew I had an interest in anxiety. And he said, I wanted you to run this group for these people. They've done everything. They've tried everything. They're not going to be an easy group, and they're a bit cynical about trying another program. Anyway, long story short, I started to work with these people using probably a similar approach to what I cover in the book. And we got about 8 weeks into the program, and I noticed that they were all starting to do pretty well. They were all starting to improve, and you could feel the difference in the room. There was a lightness. There was a lot more banter with them. They were just generally a lot more relaxed. So I fed back to them on week 8. I said, look, when I compare this to week 1, looks like, things feel very different. It feels like a lot of people are making breakthroughs. And suddenly you wouldn't have heard a pin drop in the room. Everyone just went quiet. The atmosphere changed. And this one guy then piped up and he said, bloody hell, he said, this is hard work. And he said, I don't like, this lady actually had said, oh, that makes me feel anxious that you've just said we're doing better. Mm. And they all got it instantaneously. And then this one guy who had been a previous drug addict and very open about it, but had recovered, he said, bloody hell, I thought giving up the drugs was hard. He said, this stuff's bloody addictive. And they all laughed. And I remember not only, so they laughed and they got it, but I also got it, that actually there is something quite compelling and something quite addictive about worry, because the anxiety in itself, and I think anxiety is quite nuanced. It will make you believe that to worry, to overthink, to be on guard, to be vigilant is going to stop something bad happening. Now, we live in a world where there's a lot of danger, there's a lot of threat, there's a lot of uncertainty. So actually it's very, very easy for people to get hooked on the process of anxiety. But the reason I write this book is, 90% of what we worry about in this life will never come to anything. We often spend a lot of time in anxious states when we don't need to be. So I think teaching people how to understand their anxiety, how to relate to it, how to move towards it, how to be compassionate towards that part of them, and reclaim their life is a really powerful thing to do. So I really do, the essence of this book is about hope, but it's also about helping people become unaddicted to the process of anxiety and to take responsibility for that, because that's the hard part. Because, I wasn't going to write a book that was just some fluffy bullshit, heal your anxiety in a day or just make a promise. There is no getting rid of anxiety. You're going to have anxiety until the day you die, because you should have. Your anxiety isn't going anywhere, but it should not be in the driving seat of your life. And that's a difference. You should be in the driving seat of your life. Your anxiety shouldn't. And it's your job to get to know your anxiety and accommodate it and navigate it and learn to kind of negotiate with it. But actually you then take charge. Whereas for many people, their anxiety is in charge of their life, and that's not how it should be.
Mm. Well, firstly, it's a brilliant book. Thank you for writing it on behalf of the community and the listeners. It certainly helped me so far on my journey. Do you think anxiety is, following on from what you said there, a form of stimulation in a sense? Can it bring us out of a state of boredom? Can anxiety be a stimulant?
I think it can be. I mean, it's interesting you asked that, actually, because where I grew up, so when I grew up in Northern Ireland, during that period when there was a lot of people were highly anxious, trust me, I mean, I think, but we wouldn't have been using, back then, we wouldn't have used the language that we have now. There's a lot more conversations around mental health. But a lot of people were very, very heightened. And I think we do live in an age where it's, we are heightened a lot of the time. and we're on guard and we're vigilant and we're on watch and we're competitive and we're comparing. So I do think it can be quite a charged feeling. And I think, look, if you think of the chemicals, the chemicals in the body when you're anxious are the same as the chemicals that are in the body when you're excited. So there's a real close, they're not 100%, but they're very, very closely linked. But there's and we like to be excited. We like that feeling of excitement. It's, who doesn't want to be excited? But actually, anxiety, even though it's uncomfortable and it doesn't always feel good, you've kind of got this background script that's saying it's a good idea. It's going to keep you safe. It's going to stop you screwing up. It's going to prevent a mistake. It's going to stop you getting rejected. It's going to stop you getting hurt. So there's something about that there that is quite tantalizing for people. And I think, it's got almost kind of the nuances of a background stimulant that even though don't really like it, but I'm gonna go with it. It's a bit like, you have loads of coffee, you kind of think, oh, it feels good, I'm going to enjoy it. I sort of know I might have a headache afterwards, and it may not be the best idea and I may not sleep, but it's not going to stop someone doing it. And I think anxiety is one of those things where it's like, why? I mean, I hear it all the time. Why would I give up worrying? What if I give up worrying and then something happens? It's kind of like, so you kind of hear the anxious brain creating a counter argument all of the time. And then you're constantly coming back and saying, because the odds of this going wrong are way lesser than actually the consequences that you pay for living a life filled with anxiety.
The idea of anxiety being a stimulant, perhaps, my mind went to an example of watching a horror film. A horror film is full of anxiety-inducing moments, and it's an incredibly popular genre. Is it possible for us to watch films like that, seeking out anxiety as entertainment?
It can be an almost unconscious, we kind of are drawn towards stuff. People do like horror films, they like blood, they like crime documentaries, because it's almost like it's allowing the brain to go to areas that they may not normally allow access. And there's something about the curiosity about that. And it's a bit like, when you see people who love to climb or walk to the edge of a cliff, and it just depends on context and the individual and how they're hardwired. But there is something in human nature about the curiosity, and that desire for stimulus and stuff. So we are a complicated species. But, and people can go very close towards a stimulus, or they can go the other way, where they try and avoid it. And as you know, like even in the context of ADHD, we know that some of the medication choices even can aggravate. I know some of the medications will be about increasing stimulus, and they can be stimulant based so that you've got more energy, more focus, you're able to concentrate more. But with medication choices with ADHD, if you've got anxiety either linked to your ADHD or separate to your ADHD, the stimulant medication can create problems because it will stimulate someone even more, where their anxiety will increase. So it's always about this is why I believe self-recognition and self-awareness, knowing who you are, knowing your symptoms, knowing when they play out, knowing when they're triggered, whether that's ADHD linked or linked to something else. Get to know yourself well so that you then can make the decisions on when and how you self-regulate.
Where does depression fall into this whole conversation? What's the link between anxiety and depression?
Well, it's a two-way street. I mean, I guess in my experience, when I'm working with somebody clinically, there is a condition, mixed depressive anxiety disorder. You can get people who have a mix of both. I think, if I'm being honest about it, in my experience, I often think about, if you think of anxiety and depression, I think of it in terms of speed. So if I'm working with somebody who's got, and I'm convinced they have an anxiety disorder, even though I don't like the word disorder, I'm saying that clinically, but I don't think we should use the word disorder. But if I'm working with somebody who's got an anxiety presentation, that's probably a better way of putting it, my instinct therapeutically with them will be to slow them down. If I'm working with somebody who's got depression or some sort of depressive presentation, my instinct will be to stimulate them. So it's always about speed. Now, I think when somebody's highly anxious, what can happen some of the time is that the anxiety can be so exhausting that there's a part of the brain called the dorsal brain. And I think sometimes what can happen is that part of the brain will kick in almost to shut down the stimulus to allow the brain time to recover. So I think what can then happen is somebody can have a period of anxiety that's kind of quite elongated, and then the dorsal brain will kick in and it will almost deliberately shut them down, slow them down, decrease their energy, decrease their mood, make them sleep more, and it can almost be part of recovery to allow the brain to get back to that point of equilibrium. So I guess, again, there isn't a clear-cut answer, but I do think, the majority of times when I'm with somebody, within the first minute, I'll work out whether it's a dominant anxiety presentation I'm dealing with or a mood presentation. Now, somebody who has a more dominant mood presentation, they might be undercharged, demotivated, sleeping a lot or not sleeping a lot, not really feeling hopeful or optimistic about the future. Generally, things feel heavy and dark. So they might have an elongated period where they feel like that, but then they might then have a secondary period of anxiety where they worry about their life because they just haven't got the energy. So that can be a secondary anxiety linked to mood. So again, it's always dependent on the individual, but you'll spot it very quickly at the beginning of a session when you're working with someone.
Are there 3 things in our everyday life that make anxiety worse?
I would say probably the first is, stimulus. If you know that certain stimulus aggravate your anxiety, that's something to be aware of. I think the second thing I would say is to be aware of your interpretation of what's happening, because you might make a judgment. If you yawned at the moment, for example, I could interpret that as boredom. And then draw the conclusion that you're bored with this conversation and that you don't like it. And I could then become anxious because I've misinterpreted what you've said. And I think then the third thing would be just the general day-to-day maintenance of, what have you eaten today? What foods have you put into your body? Where's the balance been? Where's the space been in your day? Where are the moments when you just literally caught a breath? So I kind of think these are all of the things that, it's like getting into your car, isn't it? It's like you get into your car and you go to drive off, you check your mirror, do the old gear check, you make sure your doors are locked, you make sure that the seatbelt's on. I think when it comes to this work and working on yourself, you're doing similar, really. You're kind of checking in self, really, and making sure that you're ready to go.
Are there any things that we all do day to day that could be causing anxiety without us realizing it?
I mean, probably most of it, to be quite honest. I mean, it's a huge question in a way. I mean, I would say, look, if you think about even how you start your day, I would say, okay, how you begin your day, I think can be really influential in how your day ends. But so if you get out of bed and you just crash into your day, and there hasn't been any stop, and there hasn't been any kind of checking in perspective, there hasn't been any checking in yourself. Well, it's kind of almost like you crash into the day without any preparation whatsoever. So I think that's just kind of one simple example. Okay, setting yourself up for the day can make an enormous difference to how you function throughout the day. I really am I'm a strong advocate of the connection between gut and mind, because we so much of the research is telling us that gut health and mental health are interlinked. So even at the beginning of the day, what food have you put into your body? Foods that are high in sugar, high in fats are inflammatory. We know that anxiety is an inflammatory condition. So if you're inflaming your body, well, then you're going to inflame your anxiety. How are you communicating? How are you looking after your own needs? When are you seeking out support and help when you need it? I mean, the list is endless. I mean, there are a number of things that we either do or don't do that are going to either make our anxiety worse or actually help it feel more level and more manageable.
What do you think the opposite of anxiety is?
Peace. And that's a tall order.
I suppose it's a great answer. And I think I agree. You're in a fascinatingly unique position where you've spoken to so many patients about anxiety. And I suppose, have you seen any themes that are reoccurring that create peace within your clients?
I'll probably look. I mean, my perspective is probably different to some other psychotherapists and stuff. I spent 10 years working with people who were terminally ill, and I guess that changed my life and it changed my perspective and everything really. So when I did that for about 10 years, and I think when you're working with people who are facing their mortality on a regular basis, I mean, it's part of your day-to-day work. It really makes you stop and evaluate everything very, very differently. So I guess really what I see most of the time in my work, in my clinical work, is I see most people getting in their own way. And I see most people taking their lives way too seriously and placing emphasis and energy on the wrong things. And I guess my 10 years in that work taught me a lot about perspective, about what was important, about what mattered, what didn't matter so much. So I guess it gave me a really unique perspective to really stand back and evaluate very, very differently. Because when you're working with people who are facing death, and this could be a young person in 18, you know, who are having to deal with something huge like that, you can't not, unless you're completely dissociated, you can't not stop and look at your own life. So I guess really when I'm working with people, and if I see them creating a lot of anxiety in their life, you know, there is always this part of me that's thinking it's too short. You haven't got, you know, you may not have the time that you think you have. Is this really going to matter in a year's time? Is this going to matter in a week's time? So it's kind of thing. I think we do a lot of clinging to the old stuff. A lot of us cling to the past. I think a lot of us resist the future and try and control it and demand predictability and believe that we have to control everything, when actually I do think that, I guess the value of my experience has been, it's taught me a lot about the importance of letting go more and trusting more and going with life rather than working against it. And I think I've never met an anxious person who was able to go with life. They're often trying to battle, fight, control, manage. They want it to be different than it is. When actually, I think when I start to work with people, then part of the work then has become, I wonder what it would be like for you to start to work with life and go with life as it is, rather than trying to believe that you can control it and that you can create certainty and predictability, because it doesn't exist.
You mentioned something there that if someone's at the end of their life and they know that the end of their life is imminent, that's, I imagine for a lot of people, a very uncertain time going into the unknown. And you said earlier, anxiety, a lot of the time, catastrophizing is
The intolerance.
Intolerance to the uncertainty. But also, if anxiety is worrying about future events, does anxiety evaporate at the end of your life, or does it remain?
Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on the individual, really. And I guess, and you know, I'm not just talking about end of life stuff, but I think people in life in general can make that decision. Okay, I'm willing to, like, for example, in those days, it was about, you were never really focused on people dying. You were focused on how they can live as fully as possible whilst dying. But actually, that's all of us. That's all of our lives. You know, none of us are here for a long time. You know, we're all kind of moving in the same direction. So it's the same thing, really. It's about, can we live as fully as possible? And if worry and anxiety and all of these things that we tie ourselves up in knots with are getting in the way of our life, well, then can we get out of the way?
Do you think people in general have a misconception as to what happiness is, which sets an individual up for disappointment when they actually reach their goal?
I think for me, it's probably about, when the subject to happiness is a complicated one, but I'm often curious about why people want to be happy and what that means to them. So when I hear people talking about happiness, or I was listening to someone talking recently about manifesting, and this, don't get me started on that, but it's I think it's directly linked, because I often hear people say, okay, I was hearing, I won't say who I heard talk. I heard someone recently talking about manifesting and believe in what you want to believe. I'm not going to criticize anyone else's beliefs. For me, it's not about the manifesting, it's about why you're manifesting. And so when people often talk about happiness, they talk about, okay, I will be happier when I get the bigger job, more money, more success, more followers, more likes, whatever it might be. So I'm interested in about why would you think that's going to make you happier? And I guess most times when I hear people talking about seeking more or wanting more in their life or believing they can be happier, it's because they believe that when they get whatever it is they want, that it will actually sort out the inner stuff. So, I see it all the time, and I work with a lot of people who have huge profiles. They've got enormous success, fame, money, notoriety. And I've discovered with all of them right across the board, it doesn't matter whether they're an actor, a pop star, multi-millionaire. What I've discovered is with all of them is that all of that never ever brought the happiness they thought it would. Because actually, if they've got internal stuff going on, if they don't feel good about themselves, if they don't trust themselves, if they feel they're not good enough, if they treat themselves appallingly, or they're just not at ease with who they are as a human being, then they're going to continue to struggle. But what most people do is most people avoid that stuff because they don't want to go there. A bit like the anxiety, most people don't want to go near the darker stuff. So what they do is they transfer it out and they think, okay, when I get this, when I achieve that, when I'm at this point in my life, this will suddenly magic it all better, and then I'm going to feel happy and I'm going to feel good. I've never once seen it work in my career. Because unless you're willing to go to the internal stuff and go to the real stuff, which, most people run a mile from, then none of this stuff will ever meet that need. It's a bottomless pit. So I'm always curious about happiness. I'm always curious about what it is. Why do you want to be happy? What does happiness look like for you? And what do you think it will achieve? That's the more important questions for me.
It's so true. I hear someone, I'll be happy when I buy that car, or when I sell my business, or when I summit Everest, and they, extreme example, but they do it, and it's often depression on the other side. It's often a deep hole because they don't feel the way they were expecting to feel, and they don't know where to go next. How do you connect, and how do you do things for intrinsic reasons rather than extrinsic goals?
I think it's always about going to the needs. If I meet somebody and they're saying stuff like, I'm not good enough, I'm rubbish, I'm a failure, or whatever the context might be, most people will hold on to those beliefs and kind of believe them as truths. And often there isn't a lot of validity or truth in them, but what people do is they connect to it as if it was the truth. And then when you start to break it down with somebody and say, well, is that absolutely true? And what happens to you when you believe it is an absolute truth? Then they realize, well, I end up feeling rubbish. So often you're working with people and you're helping them understand that what you're often doing is attaching to an old story. And for most people, it's about, they somewhere along the line, they've been told they're not good enough, or they're a failure, or they're rubbish, or I don't know, it can be anything. It doesn't matter. But most people never really update that information. It's incredible what we carry into adulthood, including anxiety. We carry all that stuff along. We've never really updated the information. And I guess for me, this work is always about helping people. You're helping people see where they're struggling and where they've got stuck. But you're also helping to see that they might need to go in, and they also might need to kind of update some of the information. But a lot of the time people don't. People just play out patterns over and over and over again and hold on to the same belief, and then operate from a system maybe that they were operating from as a 10-year-old, and they're a 42-year-old trying to manage a business and look after a couple of kids, but they're 10-year-old still in charge.
This has been truly fascinating, Owen, and it's a fascinating book, and there's a link to buy it in the description. Just before we end, I want to do the ADHD agony aunt section, which is called the washing machine of woes. Each week I ask my community for a woe, an ADHD woe, and I put it in the washing machine because my ADHD item is the washing machine, because I always forget my laundry in the machine. And I ask all my guests, do you forget your laundry in the machine?
You forget lots of things. And it's normally about volume for me. I'm a perfectionist,
right? Okay.
A real perfectionist, and I often take on too much, believing that I should and I can't do them all. I'm getting much better at it, but yeah, I forget lots of things.
I'm getting slightly better too, since I've started using the Tiimo app, which is the sponsor of the show. This week in the washing machine of woes, somebody has asked, I've suffered from panic attacks my whole life and I just never know when they might strike. They can often come after a bad night's sleep. I have an interview coming up soon and I just wondered if you had any advice on how to control my anxiety before it.
Okay, don't try and control the anxiety.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's it's fascinating actually how often you get a clue in how somebody words a question because she wants certainty of not having the panic before this moment. So the actual, what I would say is, like for most people, it's fascinating. The panic attacks have come up quite a bit today in the conversation. Most people with panic attacks will focus on not wanting to have the panic or not wanting to have the feeling. But here's the thing. I can confidently say I've met thousands of people in my career who have had panic attacks, and none of them have ever described anything awful happening as a result of the panic attack. So the panic attack has never killed them. They've survived. Nothing awful has ever happened, and any of the catastrophes that the mind have created have never really come to anything. So what I would say is, to the person who's asked a question, maybe instead of trying to control the panic, maybe just allow it to be and accept that if it did happen, you would cope, you would manage, and that it would come and go because it's done every single time you've had a panic attack. Because that way then you take the pressure off, you take the weight of responsibility off, and you're not trying to control it. So it's suddenly about, I wonder what it would be like. Probably a better way of answering that question would be is when I'm treating somebody with panic disorder, what I will do deliberately is, and most good therapists will do this here, is you will induce panic in session. So you will deliberately say, okay, let's induce a panic attack so that the person realizes that they can not only, they can induce a panic, but actually they can tolerate it and they can experience that the panic will come and it will go and nothing terrible has happened. So what I'd say to this person is welcome the panic in, should it happen. Don't try to control it and know that it will come, it will go, and you'll be fine.
How do you induce a panic attack?
You get somebody to hyperventilate. You get them to recreate a time when they panicked before. What would be the most awful thing that's happened? What would be so bad about panicking in front of me? So, you can do it really quickly, really, really quickly. And it sounds counterintuitive. It sounds it sounds almost a bit barbaric, but actually it's a really powerful thing to do is because you're helping the person realize that they can survive it, they can manage it, they can tolerate it, and actually none of the catastrophes. And then what can sometimes happen is that they're not able to induce panic. You say, well, if you're not able to induce panic and you're not able to, then you are in control.
Powerful, like facing your demons, I guess.
Yeah, you're in control. Yeah. So the next time a panic attacks, if panic does move in, you're in control because you've been able to take control today.
Penultimately, Owen, I want to reveal what your ADHD item is. I ask all my guests to bring in an item that most represents ADHD for them, and yours is a pair of glasses.
Yep.
If you could kindly explain why
actually,
glasses.
two pairs of glasses. I brought two actually, and whether it's ADHD or anxiety or actually anything in life. It's a really simple analogy actually, and I sometimes use it with a client, and I think that whatever the difficulty you're presented with, so if it were ADHD, for example, and ADHD was creating challenges or problems in your life and difficulties, or either it's anxiety or depression or whatever you're dealing with, and it's never one thing in my experience. I think I rarely see people coming with a singular causation. There's normally multiple factors that cause challenge. And I think the way I see it is that we always have two choices in life. These are my normal reading glasses, and I think they come, it's a clear lens. Okay. And if I'm seeing life through a clear lens, and by that I mean I'm in a steady state, my inner platform's steady, I'm using my rational brain, I'm using my emotional intelligence, and I'm grounded, then whatever's going on for me, I can manage very, very well. And I will cope, I will manage, and I'll flourish when I need to. Now, some of the time, as we all do, I might opt for a different route. And I guess the other route is I can see life through a different lens. And that might be, I'm going to put these on, I'm going to look completely ridiculous, but I'll see life through a different lens, and it might be a darker lens, and things may not be as clear. And they may be a bit more irrational, they may be a bit more dysfunctional, I may not take responsibility, and things might feel way more difficult than they need to. and my distress levels might go up more. So I guess really the item of, is basically about, regardless of what's going on in our lives, we have two choices the entire time with how we deal with our lives. And we have choices about what lens we through our life see, how we see our life. And we can make decisions about, okay, will I view it through the lens of clarity, or will I view it through the lens of kind of more darkness and dysfunction? And we have that choice.
And does that alter the perspective of how you view things, and therefore your emotional response and anxiety levels to it?
Absolutely, because I think if you're viewing life through the lens of clarity, whatever it is, and they're the choices that we all know what healthy choices look like. Every one of us do. We know when we're making healthy choices. Well, then generally it's a steadier state and a steadier outcome. Whereas when we do go down the kind of more dysfunctional, chaotic, not taking responsibility, blaming, pity, powerlessness, feeling victimized, then it creates internal distress. And we all have that choice. Regardless of our circumstances, regardless of what life has delivered, we have choices on what we can do. I guess really the item is about just always be mindful of the lens through which you're seeing your life.
And can't you buy glasses that are called transitions? You go outside and it automatically turns into sunglasses.
Didn't know that, but there you go.
There you go. Probably not a good idea to automate everything.
But I just wanted to use it as the analogy, because I think we all do this at times, myself included. I think we sometimes can fall into traps of feeling, and we all know what it sounds like, in our heads. This is not fair. This is wrong. This shouldn't be happening. This is terrible. This is shit. Everyone else is doing better. We can view life through these darker lenses, and it creates difficulties, but we don't need to do that. We do have the choice to think, okay, what would a different perspective look like?
That's amazing. Great advice for everyone listening. Thank you, Owen. Finally, the last section, I'm going to deliver a letter that was written by the previous guest. The previous guest, Owen, wrote 3 rules to live by, and they put it in this envelope, posted it in that post office down there, and I'm going to deliver it to you. And if you could kindly open it and read the 3 rules to live by from the previous guest.
Wow. 3 rules to live by. 1, take time for yourself. Your happiness is important. Secondly, keep an open mind. Always listen and learn. Difference is magical. And thirdly, don't be afraid of change, of feelings, of life. We get one, enjoy it. Good advice.
But on behalf of the community, Owen, and myself, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So great to add colour and context to my own life that has, I think, been full of anxiety. And as I said before, lots of anxiety, panic attacks in the past. But it's good to hear you put colour and context to it and add meaning. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.